we have 300 days of sunshine every year and the highest price of electricity into the developed world. And so the economics of installing solar and batteries will make sense here. Essentially what they do is that they store your excess solar electricity during the day in the battery, and then you use the battery at night instead of drawing off the grid.
How effective is it in achieving sustainability targets?
Sure, there are a number of areas that the development is going to perform very high from a sustainability perspective. Many of the dwellings will have solar, and a number of them will also have battery to provide 24-hour renewable power. What we have distinctly in Australia is very high electricity prices relative to other countries, so the economics of using batteries will make sense here faster than other parts of the world.
Gemma, we are going to talk about your PhD in the context of disruptive innovation, a term made popular in recent months by our Prime Minister, who has picked it up as a way to describe his new government's approach to the future. Perhaps you could explain where this term has come from.
The term disruptive innovation was coined by Clayton Christensen, a Harvard business professor, in the 90s. And he had drawn upon researchers from the early 1920s actually that came up with ideas of creative destruction, Schumpeter. So for example, the motor vehicle disrupted the horse and cart. And then also waves of innovation. Kondratiev came up with these ideas that there are 6 waves, and the wave we're in right now is the technological wave. And so Christensen drew upon this research base to come up with the notion of disruptive innovation in a contemporary sense. Disruption from his perspective can't be driven by policy, because policy can change depending on whoever's in power at the time. Whereas we've had a more broader look at disruption in terms of it could come from any source really.
The innovative waves change everything. The technologies are not just technologies, they affect the business models, the whole energy system, the whole way our cities work. So I'd like to take that idea a bit and see how it's now applying to this whole new thing of solar photovoltaic systems complete with batteries. Let's start by just explaining what this is, what's going on, and particularly in Perth, where it seems we're leading the crowd.
So I'll just start by saying that if you think about what happens when you turn on your TV, the way that you get electricity to your television has remained relatively unchanged for the past century. It's essentially a system where you've got large power generators outside of town connected to your house by poles and wires. And those power stations are usually coal or gas. But probably in the past 5 or 10 years, a new system has started to emerge. And that's where we've put solar panels on our roofs, and in Australia now we've got more than 1.4 million houses with rooftop solar, and in Perth we've got nearly 200,000 homes with rooftop solar, and that's growing at above 20% per annum consistently now for more than 5 years. And in fact this year just gone it's grown at 27%, so it's very substantial.
How much does that give in terms of power?
It now represents more than a fifth of the overall energy supply. And if you add up all of the solar panels, it's now the largest power station in aggregate on our energy system here in Perth. So it's very substantial. And
was this predicted?
Absolutely not, actually. When people first started to put solar panels on their roofs, it was driven by a subsidy from the government called a feed-in tariff, which was very high. And so the solar panels were very expensive, but the government subsidy made it worthwhile for people to install them. But the government tapered back its subsidy, and rightly so, as the price of the solar panels declined, and now solar panels are very cheap and the subsidy is very low. Actually, what government had predicted when they would reduce the subsidy is that the growth in solar panels would flatline. No one would buy them anymore, and it's completely been the opposite. Nobody predicted the uptake, and in Perth it's driven by a few factors. One of them is that we have 300 days of sunshine a year here, and so the solar panels generate electricity, for the greater majority of the year. And so we are able to really utilise that asset and make it pay back the investment quicker than perhaps in cloudier places or less hot places. The other thing is that we've got really high electricity prices in Perth and also nationally, and they've grown exponentially in line with the consumer price index over the past decade. And this is a situation unique to Australia. Electricity prices haven't grown astronomically in line with the CPI in other countries.
Why is that? Why are we spending so much more on power than everywhere else?
There are a few reasons. The reasons are different on the west coast of Australia to the east. In the west, actually, we have subsidised electricity. The government subsidises our electricity to the tune of $500 million every year. And the government wants to move to more cost-reflective pricing. And so that's actually going to drive prices up further into the future. And the other thing is that we have an ageing poles and wires network, which requires upgrade. And some of the networks are connecting to very small towns and are very expensive to maintain and run. On the east coast of Australia, it's a slightly different story. Economic incentives were given to network operators to upgrade the network, and a lot of overspeccing was done. And so a lot of money was spent that wasn't needed to be spent. And they also forecast increased growth in electricity demand, which actually wasn't borne out, which is another story talking about how we're starting to be less energy intensive in running our economy.
Okay, we'll get to that when we start talking about the whole energy system changing, but now we've got to add batteries into that. Tell us about batteries.
So batteries are a little bit the holy grail, because obviously solar panels only generate electricity when the sun's shining, and that's usually for about 5 hours a day. So if you're not home during the day, your electricity is being uploaded to the grid at a low feed-in tariff, and then at night, or when the sun's not shining, you're buying power back at, say, 26 cents per kilowatt hour. And so even though you might be generating more electricity than you need, you're still getting a bill. And what's been missing up until now is storage, cost-effective storage. And what's happened in the past probably 18 months is that the price of batteries, namely lithium iron phosphate batteries, has come down dramatically. And that's a result of the fact that we're mass producing batteries now for all kinds of reasons. So for our mobile phones, for laptops, and also for electric vehicles.
So let's just quickly put aside the myth that lithium is going to run out. Do you know much about that one?
Sure.
It seems to be a bit of a myth promoted by certain oil companies.
Well, there is a limited amount of lithium available, but it isn't the only chemistry of battery. There are many other types of batteries, such as zinc bromide batteries, flow batteries, liquid batteries, and they're all being heavily researched and will, I think, be deployed and be cost effective within a short time frame. But certainly the most readily available and commercially viable technology is lithium iron phosphate. So I see it as a kind of a bridge storage technology that for the next decade will be the mainstay, and these other chemistries will replace it. But storage, the solution storage is here to stay, and there are many other technologies that will support it if we do run out of lithium, but it's not going to happen imminently.
Can you now get a package of solar plus the lithium ion battery as a whole household energy system?
Absolutely. Yeah, so you can now purchase a solar panel and battery package that will meet 70-80% of your household electricity needs. And we're talking around $12,000 for a system like that, which is pretty amazing, given that solar panels cost that much, as little as 5 years ago, and only provided you with electricity for 5 hours a day. And now we've got an equivalent amount of money in today's terms, which will provide you with virtually 24-hour renewable power.
So let's start with your research that was done on Josh Burns' house, which is the first research we've done on monitoring a lithium ion phosphate battery system. What have you found there?
Josh built a 10-star house. It doesn't need mechanical heating and cooling, and it's very thermally efficient so that it remains comfortable in hot summer days and in cold winter days and nights. Josh also has a 3 kilowatt solar system on his roof, and he was generating a lot more electricity than his household actually needs. In fact, more than 75% more electricity than his household was consuming. But in spite of that, he was getting an electricity bill because, as I mentioned before, He's selling power at 7 cents per kilowatt hour and buying it back at 26 cents when the sun's not shining. And so we thought, what would happen if we put a battery in and we store some of that excess solar power and use that at night instead of buying it back from the grid at a high price. We've put a battery in which is about 8 kilowatt hours of storage, and it's taken him more than 90% off grid. The agenda wasn't to take him 100% off grid. We did look into it, but what we saw was that actually to do that, you need to size the battery and the solar system much larger for those days in winter, consecutive days in winter when the sun's not shining. And it would effectively be producing power for those few days and sitting redundant for the rest of the year. It's not a smart solution. The payback period for that extra piece of storage and solar would be a long, long time. And the other problem is taking him off grid entirely is that he wouldn't be able to upload his battery sourced electricity to the grid. That's 76%. So he's part of a system and contributing to the system. So it made us realise what we knew intuitively was that the grid's important for all kinds of reasons, and that in looking at storage, it's not about everyone going off grid, although there will be some innovators or that decide to do that. I don't think that it's going to be a mainstream solution.
You're making a very clear point that although we can get over 90% off grid, you don't particularly want to see that being 100%. So we're not being hippie type, self-sufficient, completely who cares about the rest of the world type technologies. This is actually just minimising the amount of extra growth that's going to be needed in the system by the old model, the coal-fired power stations. They just don't, they won't need any more power stations, will they?
No, I mean, I mentioned the analogy with the television, and we've had this system for a century, and the new paradigm that's emerging is where we've got power stations on our roofs connected through poles and wires. The poles and wires will be sized appropriately for delivering smaller amounts of power, and that will perhaps have only a couple of large power stations as a backup system for those days in winter when the sun's not shining for a few days in a row. So it's a very different system to the one we're used to.
The other part of your research has been about more dense housing, because separate housing like Josh's is one part of the market, big part, and that's where most of the PVs have been appearing. But we've also got lots of industries and commercial activity, big centres, shopping centres, and all of these places are going to need to be part of this solar revolution. And you've started to work on what it would mean for denser precincts and housing developments. Can you just explain that a bit?
Sure. So although we've got a lot of rooftop solar in freestanding houses, we haven't got anywhere near as much percentage-wise in units and apartments. And if you've got an apartment up to sort of 4 or 5 stories, you can actually fit enough solar on the rooftop to provide most of your electricity needs to the residents. But in developing a system like that, there are some challenges. So you've seen a few developers offering solar panels for apartments, but they're individually wiring a solar panel to each apartment with its own inverter. And it's not a terrible system, but it's limited in that if you've got one person that's not home, they're selling power at that moment to the grid for 7 cents, and the neighbour next door is buying it at that same moment for 26 cents. And so you've got no optimisation of the fact that you've both got electricity spare right, on your doorstep. And the other issue is that some of these properties are tenanted and investor owned. And so investors are like, why would I put solar panels in this apartment when the tenant's going to get the benefit for it? So there are a few challenges, and the research that we've done has sought to kind of overcome those by developing a microgrid, an embedded network within the apartment building that's grid connected still as a backup, but has solar and batteries as a microgrid. And so each of the apartments is connected to the microgrid and sources its power from there, but they pay their electricity bill to the strata company instead of to the utility. So it provides a revenue stream to the owner to justify the capital investment of the solar and the batteries. And it also means that neighbours share electrons with each other.
That's a nice idea. Sharing electrons.
Yeah.
How cosy. But the model is that the strata company, which is meant to manage public spaces and so on, actually becomes a utility.
Correct. Yeah.
So it's a micro sharing device for power as well as for, well, you can think of lots of other things like water and waste and electric vehicles.
Absolutely. I think you're going to see these kind of strata utility hybrids emerge. You're already starting to see it in some instances. For example, strata companies are buying power in the wholesale electricity markets and selling it on to the residents and making a profit out of that. This is an adaptation of that. Rather than sourcing power from the wholesale market from largely fossil fuel-based electricity sources, they're actually generating it renewably on site. And so there's more potential economic gain. But as you say, it could be used for water, for waste, for electric vehicles. And I think that this system is going to be adopted in all of those areas.
So tell us about White Gum Valley and the opportunities that this provides to show the future to the world.
Sure. We've got a development there called Gen Y, and it's 3 apartments which were designed for the millennials, the younger generation, and it's very energy efficient home, and there's bike storage and grey water recycling, so it's got lots of other different elements. But from an energy perspective, what we've done is we've pioneered this way of doing a microgrid. And what it shows is that it can be done technically, that there is demand for it in the marketplace. People are willing to buy it, either from an investor perspective with tenants or owner-occupiers. And it shows how we can get more deployment of renewable energy in our housing stock in Australia, and in doing so drive down the cost of electricity for consumers. So it can be low cost and low carbon housing.
And the Arena project, what's that going to do?
Sure. So we had a launch for the Gen Y solar storage on strata battery trial, and we invited developers. There were more than 150 there, and there was so much excitement and energy around this. People are really interested to see how they can differentiate their product in the marketplace when, particularly in a situation where there's a lot of supply on the market. How do you make sure that your apartment is more appealing to the punters than others? And given that there is strong demand for solar, there's good evidence to support that people would want to buy this an apartment that's got this opportunity to have 24-hour renewable power. And we got a lot of media around the idea, the concept, and a lot of interest from developers. And we put 3 projects together and submitted that to Arena. They've come back and they want to fund the most imminent one, which is the White Gum Valley project. The Gen Y development is in the WGV White Gum Valley project, but we're now doing larger scale battery trials within that greater precinct of 50 dwellings, and it's a mixture of different housing types. There's masonettes, apartments and townhouses, and so they'll have different energy usage profiles and different amounts of people using them, and also different energy system design. So we're scaling and fleshing out the solar storage on strata for different types of housing in the Australian context.
When you get above 5 to 8 stories type housing and there's less and less roof space available per unit, can you move to the car park areas and then link in the electric vehicles to it, or what?
So for cities that are higher density, or buildings that are higher density, you can certainly incorporate on car park roofs and the roofs enough electricity to perhaps provide some power to the residents or to the common user areas. But that comes back to the reason why the grid is absolutely essential. So the suburbs, in a sense, will generate, the Josh's houses will generate excess power, which will provide electricity to the dwellings that are more hungry than their roof space will allow. Once solar panels on facades become more cost effective, they're not quite there, then to an extent the sky's the limit.
Yeah.
So we'll see much more renewable energy autonomy in the built environment at higher density then. But I think we're probably 3 to 5 years away from that, that being the case.
Okay, so it's all happening, and how are the utilities going to adapt to this? Because their old business model did not incorporate this. This is totally disruptive to their system. How are they going to adapt?
Well, it depends is the answer. There's one of three or a combination of three ways that they can react or respond, and I've termed them fight, flight or innovate. So with fight, it's actually where they lobby for one of two outcomes. The first one is that they lobby to protect their revenue stream. We pay a daily supply charge for electricity. They might lobby to have that increased so that no matter how much power we draw from the grid, we're going to pay a high bill. They can also lobby against the deployment of more renewable energy to limit the amount that we would put on our roofs or limit large-scale renewable energy projects so that they're not competing against large-scale coal and gas-fired power stations. So there's a number of activities that they could do to protect the existing assets and to stop the deployment of new assets or to ratchet up the costs so that they make money whether they provide a service or not. So that's the fight response. The flight response is one of two things: either do nothing and pretend it's not happening.
There's a bit of that going on.
Essentially block your ears and say, I can't hear anything. Or the other thing is to divest, to sell out and say, I don't see, that there's a future in this business and sell off the assets. And they could be generation assets or poles and wires. In New South Wales, actually right now, the government is selling off its poles and wires assets. Now, I'm not suggesting that it's because they're running away because they don't see value in it. There are other, economic drivers, capital raising for the government to be doing this. But a buyer would be thinking about what's the value of this asset going to be long term given this new energy paradigm that's emerging, and that the bid that they submit reflects that. And so that's the flight response. The final one is innovate. And there are a number of aspects to that. One is that they can start to offer solar and batteries and supporting technologies to their existing consumer base and cannibalise some of their existing business, which might sound counterintuitive, but if they don't do that, they might lose their customers to other competitors who are offering the same new technologies. There's also non-cannibalistic offerings, so they could offer solar and batteries to customers that they're not currently new customers. So in rural areas where people are perhaps on a diesel generator, they could be sold solar and battery systems by the utilities. There's also new technology platforms. So in Perth from December 2015, we're able to sell our battery sourced electricity to the grid. And I think that will pave the way for time of day feed-in tariffs. We pay a flat rate at the moment regardless of the time of day, but I think that very soon we'll see different prices for different times of day. And as a result of that, we'll start to see apps where we can decide when we want to sell our power depending on what the price is and maximise the return for ourselves. And we'll all become like mini utilities. So there's these kind of technology platforms. And then another area is around being an energy services company. So back to the Strata. The Strata company is an energy services company, but we'll also see energy service companies, which we commonly call ESCOs, pop up that will start to look after these assets and maintain them and replace them, and there's a business model out of that. So there's a whole different landscape of potential innovation actions, and utilities might do a combination of fighting and innovating, or just innovate, and we're seeing that already in Australia. For example, Alinta are offering solar and batteries to consumers. Synergy, the retailer in Perth, are going to be offering batteries next year, and a number of utilities on the East Coast are already offering these as well.
But this has actually got its own momentum up, hasn't it? It's going to drive the market. We could actually get fossil fuel free very quickly. These processes become exponential, don't they? This is like this is why it surprises all the governance models. They're not ready because it happens so quickly. Is it Tony Seba that's been writing about this? Tell us about that.
Yeah, so Seba looked at the kind of ontology or the behaviour of companies, how they don't see this disruption coming. And an example that probably illustrates that is Kodak. So Kodak actually invented the technology for digital cameras. They were a film-based camera company, and they actually patented hundreds of innovations around digital technology. So they invented the technology, they'd patented it, they saw there was a massive market, they estimated it to be around $200 billion in size. They were going to get a slice of it. But what they hadn't anticipated or understood was what the business model would be around the technology. So the disruption was that they thought that they would be getting a slice of the action, the commercial action, for every photo that was taken, not realising that that's not how digital technology was being monetised. And so they filed for bankruptcy in 2012. So they had the technology, but they didn't understand the business model. And it shows that even though you think you might be prepared, there's a number of different factors that need to coalesce together to make you innovate enough to survive.
And the alternative came so quickly, it just swept them away.
Totally, yeah, completely. No one ever imagined that Kodak wouldn't exist anymore. Those that are resisting the change are obviously going to suffer the most. I think the change is inevitable, but the suffering is more optional. If you are resisting the change, you're not going to innovate at all. If you try and innovate, there are no guarantees of success.
Yeah.
So I think it'll be very interesting to see who innovates and provides both the right technology at the right price with the correct business model.
Yeah, well, that's the new game. If you don't, what happens? Well, tell us about stranded assets.
Yeah, stranded assets are the things that you find in your back cupboard that no longer have any use anymore, gathering dust. So when the motor vehicle was invented, people were saying there's no way that people would ever do away with horse and carts, but obviously you don't see them in our cities these days. And so that's an example from yesteryear, but music technology is quite an easy one to understand as well. We had records and tapes, CDs, and now it's largely entirely digitised, so there's no actual physical technology anymore. So there are these technologies which once had a value, and the companies that sold them had a value, but when no one wanted them anymore, those assets became stranded.
How does it apply to energy then?
Well, if you've got a generation asset or a transmission asset that is being used less, then it's being valued less. And we've already seen this in Europe, where $500 billion has been wiped off the valuation of utilities in Europe. And most of them 10 years ago had credit ratings of A or above, and now I think none of them do. And that's a result of the rapid deployment of renewable energy, taking away the demand or declining the demand for their product. And the business models of utilities has largely been one where they optimise the asset, as in work it and use it 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. And solar has eroded the business model for 5 hours a day when the sun's shining. And what batteries are going to do is potentially erode it 24 hours a day.
Yeah.
Particularly with large-scale solar and wind compared to gas and coal, the marginal cost of producing the electricity for renewables is zero because you don't have an input fuel. Whereas coal and gas, you have to buy the input fuel. And so when they're dispatching one or the other, solar and wind actually is cheaper, the marginal cost of producing it. As we put more and more renewables online, the relative cost of coal and gas-fired electricity is greater than the renewable alternative. And therefore the value of that company long-term, its cash flows long-term, is less, and it's at a greater risk of becoming stranded.
Okay, so let's then talk about our future cities. The urban systems are going to change, and that involves people and lifestyles and their choices as well, the cultural changes. So your research has looked at what drives people to live in these dense areas as they rejuvenate, and tell us the results of that.
Anecdotally, we heard from developers that people want green stuff in their buildings, but they're not willing to pay for it. Time and time again we heard this. But on the other hand, we would see people are buying solar panels in droves. And so it was hard to reconcile these two seemingly opposing views. So we constructed a piece of research to interview people that have actually bought or rented in developments that have green offerings, and compared how important those green features were against things like price and location or other factors. And we looked at 27 medium density developments in Perth that had been recently constructed. And how it's different from other research is that a lot of research around types of housing preferences is focused on stated preferences. So that's like, if I say to you, what are you going to have for dinner tonight? and you say, I'm going to have chicken, and I speak to you the next day and you tell me, I ask you, what did you have for dinner? And you said, I had a hamburger. So you stated that you're going to have chicken, but what you actually had was a hamburger. And a lot of the research up until now has been on what kind of housing would you theoretically like? And that's what you say in that situation is different to what you actually go and buy. And so this research looked at what people have actually decided. And what it showed was that in the 27 developments, a number of them had green features. And in those developments that had green features, it was a major part of the decision making in half of the cases. So half of the people bought or rented into those developments just because, for other reasons primarily, and half of them bought in or rented because of the green features. And so it showed that consumers were willing to pay and actually demanded it. And if you offer them in your development, you're actually going to increase the amount of buyers that you would otherwise have.
So we have gone from the technology through the business models, the energy systems, through to the culture and the city lifestyles that are emerging, the city systems. It does look like an innovative wave, a whole new mainstreaming of the system is we're emerging, we're starting to see it happening. Can you give us a timeline on when you think we'll see this as the new normal?
I think it'll be new normal in different areas sooner rather than later. So I think that the deployment of solar PV on rooftops, whether it be freestanding houses or the strata end of the market, that trend is going to continue, and easily by 2020 it will be the mainstream source of electricity supply in Western Australia and also parts of Australia where they have similar market conditions and sunlight. So that is so evident. In fact, so evident that our Energy Minister and Finance Minister Mike Nahan has said that by 2025 all of Perth's daytime electricity will come from solar. And then since he made that statement about 2 months ago, he's since said that by 2025, 70% of our electricity will come from solar and batteries, which infers that batteries are going to take up a large portion of the electricity supply. They're a big part of the system in that they can help manage the peak. Because at the moment, when we have hot days, we have to turn on power stations just to provide enough power for air conditioning systems. But batteries can be used to provide that electricity supply, and then we don't need to turn on those power stations or build them in the first place. And I think that is probably the most imminent thing that's going to become mainstream. But then I'd say that the next wave of innovation will be towns that are on the outskirts of the grid, which have very high maintenance costs to maintain the poles and wires. They'll come off the grid and reduce the demand. And so the utilities, I think, are in a whole world of pain if they don't innovate. In the next 5 years, I think we'll see dramatic changes to the valuations of those companies and their business models. And that's already being reflected, I think, in the forecasts for them. But I think it will become far more pronounced. And what's for certain is that the batteries will drive the more rapid deployment of solar PV. So I think, it's easily foreseeable that batteries in the next 5 years will see above 30% growth in solar PV or 40% growth annually in solar PV.
Even faster than we've got now.
Absolutely, and it's not just me saying that. Morgan Stanley, for example, put out a piece of research looking at the size of the battery market in the NEM, the National Electricity Market on the East Coast. In the NEM, there's 1.1 million houses with rooftop solar right now, and they predict that in a very short space of time, 2.4 million houses on the NEM will have solar and batteries. So that's a more than doubling of the existing solar PV deployment and batteries, with every household. So it's a massive and dramatic and imminent change to our energy system.
I think we can look forward to that future. It's not a threatening one. It's a delightful, positive contribution to the rest of the world, seeing that we can be sustainable, we can have no fossil fuels, basically, and we can still have a good life.
Absolutely. I think that the tyranny of distance that we often suffer from in Perth is not the case with the energy story. We actually are at the epicentre and forefront of what's happening, and we can demonstrate for how this orderly transition can happen in spite of the disruption. And I think that the rest of Australia and the rest of the world is going to be watching with great interest as our perfect solar storm creates the city of the future.
Thank you very much, Gemma.
Thank you very much, Peter.